Does realism kill art? Is an interesting question that I've thought about quite often. It can be interpreted in a couple different ways, what realism is, but in this context, I'd say the strive to make art as close to reality as possible. Now, I've been drawing for a long time. When I was a little kid, I would be in the after-school program, and I would just draw with markers or crayons or whatever. I would draw so many pages of pictures that my hand would hurt at the end. I would just be gripping that marker and be in pain. But I did it because I just had so much to get out onto the page. There was so much going on in my imagination that it was like overflowing out of me. And this phase didn't last forever. I wasn't drawing like this every day for years, but I miss that. I miss when I wasn't afraid to draw. That might sound kind of silly, but I used to just draw because it was fun and it was something I liked to do. But over the years, I found myself drawing less and less. And I never found myself hating drawing or painting or making art, but I just wasn't doing it as much, and it took so much willpower to start doing something. I was pretty much only ever doing art if it was for like some school project, or if I was making a gift for someone, a piece of art. And even though I was drawing less over time, I was still improving slowly. I made a lot of incremental improvements to my art. I've worked in different mediums and improved in them. But there was something that I had noticed, sort of subconsciously, that it felt like I had to try to make things more realistic. And no one was really telling me this, but I got this feeling like, I don't know if it was just reactions from people or some other things that I saw online, whatever, but it felt like the more realistic something that you made was, the better it was. It was a fundamentally more advanced piece than something else that wasn't as realistic. I didn't mind trying to draw things that were closer to real life. I found it to be a fun challenge. It would usually take longer to do something like that. But I began to question if it was really what I wanted to strive towards. And as I was thinking about this, I had started to notice a pattern that a lot of other people have noticed before me, but especially with 3D animated movies, infamously lots of Pixar movies, just any animation studio in the last 20 years has mainly switched over to 3D animation, and as the software for making these movies has gotten better, there's been this push, and it's been wavering a little bit in the last few years, but especially 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because the technology was still improving, there was this push to try to make things more realistic, more, the fidelity, the little details, everything needed to be pushed to match with the power of the technology. The technology was getting better, the tools were improving, so there was this push towards realism. And I mean, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. With all this evolving technology, you'd want to try to push it to its limits. And this wasn't just happening in movies, but in games as well. I think especially in games. A lot of games, large studios especially, were really advertising and are still advertising just how real how much detail they've put into an environment, whatever. And that's such a big selling point now. And again, it's interesting, it's good, but people are starting to find that a lot of these games that preach that their big achievement, the big appeal of the game, is how amazingly realistic and detailed it is, aren't always of the highest quality in other regards, like story or gameplay. They look great, but they're just not that fun to play. And this was being seen in some movies as well. These movies would have amazing CGI, amazing animation, but they weren't very fulfilling. And this wasn't always, it's not a direct correlation. Better looking movie doesn't equal worse writing or acting. But people would often praise these games and movies for their great graphics, and sometimes that would allow them to write off lazier writing or pacing or whatever else. So this has become a much larger discussion online and in the industry of movies and games. But coming back to just drawing, sketching, painting, I noticed that whenever I would show people my art, it was always the most realistic, detailed, well-proportioned, shaded thing that would stick out the most and be the best, the most impressive. And I wouldn't really argue. I again, the more realistic, the more time it took. But in the last year or so, I've made a lot of pieces that I really like. I've made this, and this, and this one, and this. But when it came time to choose my best piece that I had made to show off at an event at the end of the year, I chose this one. And in a way, I really liked it. It's a sketch based off of a picture that I took of my room. I spent a lot of time on it, making the proportions just right, making everything shaded well, looking as accurate to my real room as possible. And even though I had put all that time and effort into it, it didn't quite mean as much to me as those other pieces. And that's where I come back to the question of, does realism kill art? Does it defeat the point? Is there something about realism that degradates what art should be? Because you might argue art is about interpreting the real world in your own way. And by trying to make it as realistic as possible, you're defying what art should be. But on the other hand, you can say, well, even the most realistic drawing is still a drawing. It's still a interpretation, a version of real life. It's not the same. It's not a copy. It's just another interpretation, one that may look closer to what real life has to offer, but an interpretation and just a single perspective nonetheless. I decided to draw the mouse on my desk today, and at first I drew a sketch that was more focused on trying to be as real as possible. Obviously, I could have refined a lot of the details, but I didn't want to spend forever on it. I just wanted to get some of the basic proportions and shading down as accurate as I could as possible, because that's what I find to be the most important when it comes to replicating real-life sources. So I spent about 15 minutes on that, maybe 20 minutes. And then I did another sketch. It took a much less time, probably about 5 minutes. And despite being slightly more crude, being a little bit less proportionately accurate, it feels more like me. And again, not to say that I didn't enjoy drawing the more quote-unquote realistic mouse, But when I look at that and think, this one looks better, is that me talking? Or is that what I think other people would think? What does better mean? Does better mean more realistic? Does better mean more interesting? I don't know. In the end, I think what I've decided is that striving for realism in art isn't a bad thing. But making it the end-all be-all, the sole focus, the whole point of art, the end goal, you want to make the most realistic eye, the most realistic face. And maybe that will be your goal. Maybe you want to make the most realistic, accurate to life portrait of yourself or a loved one. And that's fine, that's great. But I know what I want now. And I know that I need to focus on developing what's me. I drew both of these mice. They're both me. They're the same, but they're also different. I think I can take from both of them and continue to learn. Thank you for listening.